Welcome to the CEC Report. It's the 8th of July. I'm Robert Barwick and I'm joined again by CEC leader Craig Isherwood. Welcome, Craig.
Yeah, thanks, Robbie.
In this week's CEC Report, global revolt against financial elite hits Australia, and truth about Iraq known long before the Chilcot report. So first, global revolt against financial elite hits Australia. And Craig, it's the election, the 8-week election is finally over, and we still don't know who the government is 6 days later.
Yeah, we had to wake up to vote, Robbie.
We had to wake up to vote. They lulled us into a false sense of boredom. Anyway, it's all up in the air. As of right now, this is not that newsworthy for us, but the Liberals might be able to scrape back in. That's not the point. The real story of the election is who didn't vote for the major parties, because that vote is soaring. And it confirms that the global political turmoil that is manifested in the US in the Trump and Sanders electoral success, and even though those two guys are diametrically opposite, that's not the point. There's a reason the public is turning out to vote for people they're told should not be, that they don't have the approval of the system, of the insiders. The Brexit vote in the United Kingdom, the same thing. It came from out of the blue. They didn't expect it to happen, but it happened because the people, just defied all the insiders' warnings and hysteria, etc. That phenomenon is hitting Australia as well, right? You can see it in these figures. Where it really shows up is in the Senate vote. So for the people who went and wrestled with that enormous ballot paper, and the new system of voting, right, 6 above the line or 12 below the line, 35% of them voted for someone other than the major parties, and that 35% is a record. Right now, I personally think that one of the factors here is that in the United States, their parties are looser. So Trump and Sanders were able to be part of the Republican and Democrat Party, and they attracted their support inside the parties. In the United Kingdom, you've got someone like Jeremy Corbyn, who is a total political outsider, but the Labor Party over there is not as tightly controlled as the Labor Party here, and so he was able to, from inside the Labor Party, get to a leadership position that's terrified the City of London and the whole establishment. But in Australia, we do have really tightly controlled party structures in the major parties, and so it's lawful, therefore, that the way the revolt is manifesting here is people are voting for outsiders.
And that's going to have
parties.
Robbie, what we're going to see is that control within the major parties is going to have to break down.
Yep.
Because there's no way that these parties are going to survive, and you sort of see the rage on Malcolm Turnbull's face the night of the election when he was totally enraged at the Australian people for not giving him a clear mandate. Yep. This has a really serious ramifications because, see, Robbie, last week we talked about the Inland Rail project up through Shepparton. And I know there's 2 consortiums. Now, both these are private consortiums that believe in the system of globalisation, that the only way that you can get infrastructure built is through private means. In other words, they're using the globalisation model, this idea of economic rationalism, and the current system of the last 40 years is the model that they're working on. But see, that same model is what's causing the instability, so-called, in the political system today, where you're getting more and more minor parties elected. Now, these business people, these consortiums, these big money people that are working on behalf of equity, finance and so forth, they'd love a stable government, i.e. a Turnbull majority and a Turnbull majority in the Senate, or a Labor majority and a Labor majority in the Senate under Shorten. They don't really care because they'll work with both sides of our political equation because both sides are committed to globalisation.
And they'll be able to profit from both sides.
And they'll be able to profit from both sides because the government's going to say, we don't want to be involved in building infrastructure for the people. We want to be able to minimise our losses and allow private institutions to make maximum profit. So ironically though, the Australian people are saying, we don't like the policies of the major parties, both Labor and Liberal. They're leaving the ship. 35% in the Senate is just an indication there, but also look at the House of Representatives with the 5 to 6 independents coming in. You're seeing, this is a reflection of the breakdown of what we call the 1983 or post-1983 economic consensus, where both the political parties agreed that the model of economic reform, the model of globalisation, free trade, is the way to go. Well, people all over the world, whether it be in London, in the UK, with the Corbyn phenomenon, the Brexit vote, in the US, with the phenomenon with Donald Trump, and now here in Australia, it's the same issue. People are saying, we don't like this globalisation model.
Yep.
And some smart commentators that I've heard are saying publicly, this is the inflection point. What's taking place now is actually a changing point for globalisation.
It's been in place, we trace it back to 1971, the end of the Bretton Woods system. That's when Bretton Woods was a system of fixed exchange rates and a regulated global financial system. They deregulated the hell out of the world after that, and it's been in place for 40 years, what all the 40 years has achieved is a global bankruptcy.
Yeah, and see that, Robbie, this is what people, if you look down, you start to see the curvature of what's taking place here. There's only one solution. We have to go back to bank re-regulation. We have to go back to Glass-Steagall.
Yep.
We have to have a national bank that controls the private banking system to issue credit to build large-scale projects like we did with the Snowy Mountain scheme, the Tasmanian Hydro scheme. We need a
Which,
government.
if you do it that way, you're saying it's much cheaper than these private consortiums and public-private partnerships.
And you don't have to pay taxes and tolls, as the Macquarie Bank model shows. And that's the way you actually develop and increase the physical productive output of the population. Yep. That model's coming back because that's what people are voting for. They don't want the globalisation of the major parties.
Well, so I'll just make, we have to wrap this segment up, Craig, but just in closing, we increased our vote. I mean, we represent these ideas. We increased our vote, but we don't get the publicity that, Hanson and Nick Xenophon and those guys got, which is what you require, in today's day and age to get elected to Parliament. The media black us out. So given that, it's interesting that the parties who, you look at, especially the Senate, but we have now the ALP, the Greens, Nick Xenophon team, One Nation and Jackie Lambie, they're all pushing for a Royal Commission into the banks. The Greens and One Nation are talking about our version of breaking up the banks, right, which we call Glass-Steagall, so that real banking that serves the real economy is separated from speculators. One Nation is calling for a national bank, which is our original idea. Well, it's the Labor Party's original idea. We've revived it and educated the Australian public on this. One Nation, Nick Xenophon team and Lambie, they're all being attacked as protectionists for demanding the rescue of the dairy industry, steel industries, etc. These are things that we also have called for, but that specifically is the end of this post-1983 consensus on free trade, the free market idea that you talked about. So that is, the consensus is breaking, it's happening, and that's the state of Australian politics.
That's
right?
pretty much it, Robbie, and we've played a guiding role for the last 28 years in exactly these sorts of policies coming to the fore.
And we, though, we're more thorough than the rest of them. We've researched it more than anybody. We will be talking to everybody about this. We have to make this change stick, and the CEC is going to be central to that. So this is a campaign the CEC has long been on. If you, the viewer, agree with us, get involved, call in, get a copy of our publication, read it, become a member, get involved in the CEC, because this, what happens between elections is more important, Craig, than what happens during the circus of the election, right? Frankly, that's the case. Okay, let's take a break. When we come back, we're going to talk about the Iraq War and the Chilcot Report. Welcome back to the CEC Report. Truth about Iraq known long before the Chilcot Report. So on Wednesday, a report that's been 7 years in the making, Craig, the Iraq inquiry in the United Kingdom by this gentleman, Sir John Chilcot, finally was released. And this thing is enormous. Apparently it's longer than the Bible, 1.6 million words. And it didn't take him 7 years to conclude all this. It's just there was so many political delays to try and save the butts of the people who were implicated in this report. And of course, the number one person implicated in the report is the former Prime Minister of the United Kingdom, Tony Blair. And it has implications for John Howard and Australia as well. And as proof of that, John Howard rushed out a press conference yesterday to say it's got, I'm all right, Jack. And he summed up the report by saying, I have a difference of opinion to Mr. Chilcot. That's what it comes down to.
Well, it's a bit further than that too, Robbie, because if Tony Blair is seen as a war criminal and indicted as one, that has implications for George Bush.
No, of course.
It has Dick Cheney and John Howard.
Well, and we're going to talk about how it's not, what we want to establish in this segment, and how this matter of opinion, this difference of opinion doesn't fly, right? But before we get to that, just an important thing to say about the findings of this report. It didn't go so far as to say it was illegal, because it wasn't given that in its terms of reference. And let that be a warning to anybody when it comes to any government inquiry about anything. It's always what's in the terms of reference you've got to look at, and that'll apply to a Royal Commission of the Banks here as well. But what it did find is that Saddam Hussein did not pose any urgent threat to British interests, that intelligence regarding weapons of mass destruction was presented with too much certainty, that's a typical British understatement there, that peaceful options to war had not been exhausted, and that the United Kingdom and United States had undermined the authority of the UN Security Council, that the process of identifying the legal basis was far from satisfactory, that's what it went to on that question of legality, and that a war in March 2003 was unnecessary.
Isn't that the basis there for war crimes?
Well, no, exactly, because what the United Nations exists to stop war, right? And these guys went, and they're all signed the UN Charter, Craig.
Yep.
They went against, they breached the UN Charter so they could have their own private war, and they claimed that we were supporting the moral authority of the United Nations. In the way Chilcot didn't say it was illegal because he couldn't, but in the way he crafted it, it is clearly the findings that the decision was in breach of the UN Charter, and by definition that should be a war crime under international law. Now, if you're one of the family members of the 179 British troops, the 5,000 plus United States troops, and anywhere from 150,000 to 1 million Iraqis who were killed in this war, what do you think when you hear that this war was unnecessary? That's the key bit here. Now, Blair and Howard have both refused to apologise, and they both said we would do it again with the same information. That's this idea that it's all about your perspective and your opinion, right? So what I want to show people, and then we'll take a break, but we're going to play 2 video clips, Craig, because I just want to remind the public that it wasn't a question that, oh, here was the intelligence and it's just, it looked persuasive. There were millions of people around the world who knew it was rubbish. Absolute rubbish, right? And the world saw the biggest protest in human history. 30 million people took to the streets in a coordinated global protest one weekend against it. And in the United Kingdom, that was led by the current leader of the Labour Party, Jeremy Corbyn, the guy that is hated by the faction of the party controlled by this war criminal Tony Blair, right? Well, so we're going to play this parliamentary speech of his mentor, actually, Tony Benn, and what he said in Parliament in the Iraq debate in Parliament in the United Kingdom, and then we'll play Jeremy Corbyn's speech to the crowd at this 1 million person protest in London on the time. And you can see with those two, just remind yourself how emphatically this war was opposed, because it wasn't a matter of opinion. These guys were pursuing their own agenda.
I'll finish just by saying this. War is an easy thing to talk about. There are not many people of the generation that remember it. The right honourable gentleman served with distinction in the last war. I never killed anyone, but I wore uniform. But I was in London in the Blitz in 1940, living in the Millbank Tower where I was born. Some different ideas have come in since. And every night I went down to the shelter in Thames House. Every morning I saw Dockland burning. 500 people were killed in Westminster one night by a landmine. It was terrifying. Aren't Arabs terrified? Aren't Iraqis terrified? Don't Arab and Iraqi women weep when their children die? Doesn't bombing strengthen their determination? What fools we are to live in a generation for which war is a computer game for our children and just an interesting little Channel 4 news item. Every member of Parliament tonight who votes for the government motion will be consciously and deliberately accepting the responsibility for the deaths of innocent people if the war begins, as I fear it will. Now, that's for their decision to take. But this is a quite unique debate in my parliamentary experience, where we're asked to share responsibility for a decision we won't really be taking, with consequences for people who have no part to play in the brutality of the regime which we are dealing with. And I finish with this. On October the 24th, 1945, and the former Prime Minister from Bexley, Old Chilcot, will remember it, the United Nations Charter was passed. And the words of that charter are etched into my mind and move me even as I think of them. We, the people of the United Nations, determined to save future generations, succeeding generations, from the scourge of war, which twice in our lifetime has caused untold suffering to mankind. That was the pledge of that generation to this generation, and it would be the greatest betrayal of all if we voted to abandon the Charter and take unilateral action and pretend we were doing it in the name of the international community. And I shall vote against the motion for the reasons that I've given the House.
Well, surely the message today in London, in Glasgow, and ordinary people on the streets of this country is this. Why are we spending £3.5 billion on a war that nobody wants? When there is an AIDS pandemic sweeping Africa, when a quarter of the world's children die in poverty and starvation, and we say there isn't money sufficient for our own public services. Well, the answer is an obvious one. No to war, yes to peace, yes to rehabilitation and rebuilding. And for those who say that this is a necessary and just conflict because it will bring about peace and security, September the 11th was a dreadful event. 8,000 deaths in Afghanistan brought back none of those who died in the World Trade Center. Thousands more deaths in Iraq will not make things right. It will set off a spiral of conflict, of hate, of misery, of desperation that will fuel the wars, the conflict, the terrorism, the depression, and the misery of future generations. You cannot humiliate the Palestinian people in the way that they've been humiliated and not expect some problem in the future. You cannot arm regimes like Iraq, Iran, and many others without expecting further problems in the future. Our message today here in London, 1 million and more strong, is this. We want to live in a world free from war. The way to free us from the scourge of war is to free ourselves from the scourge of injustice, of poverty, and the misery that's associated with that. This movement is giving that message to the British government. Stop now or pay a political price. Thank you very much.
So there you go. There's some real passion on display there because, well, Jeremy actually, Craig, in his words there, he forecast what has happened since. The entire unravelling in the Middle East that's produced ISIS. Let's take a break. When we come back, we'll continue this discussion. Welcome back to the CEC Report, where we're discussing truth about Iraq known long before the Chilcot Report. And Craig, before the break, we saw two UK Labor politicians, Tony Benn and Jeremy Corbyn, and significant their Labor because it was they were in government at the time. It was their Prime Minister who led the push for war, and you saw how it was an example of how emphatically this war was opposed. And so it's not about a mere opinion, it was whose opinion prevailed. The majority of the public knew this was wrong. Anyway, in the time we've got left, I want to deal with a certain myth though, because the impression that is given in the UK and most places is that Bush, or shucks, dumb, hayseed in his mouth, George Bush, led the sophisticated, suave Tony Blair into the Iraq War. If anything, it's the other way around.
Well, yeah, what we've listened to, Robbie, is what actually Tony Blair says, and what you're saying is absolutely true. Bush didn't have an original thought like this. No. He couldn't think like this.
Never make the mistake of giving George W. Bush too much credit.
No.
Dick Cheney, yes, and that's another story, but not George W. Bush. So what we're going to listen to Tony Blair in part of a speech he gave in the 5th of March 2004, when he's justifying the Iraq War. But what he lays out is his pre-existing agenda, which he first started espousing in 1999, and the Iraq War was the perfect case for it. So this is what Tony Blair had to say.
Let me attempt for you an explanation of how my own thinking as a political leader has evolved during these past few years. Already before September the 11th, the world's view of the justification of military action had been changing. The only clear case in international relations, traditionally, for armed intervention had been self-defense, response to aggression. But the notion of intervening on humanitarian grounds had been gaining currency. I set this out following the Kosovo War in a speech in Chicago in 1999, where I called for what I termed a doctrine of international community, where in certain clear circumstances, we do intervene even though we are not directly threatened. So for me, before September the 11th, I was already reaching for a different philosophy in international relations from a traditional one that has held sway since the Treaty of Westphalia in 1648. Namely, that a country's internal affairs are for it. You don't interfere unless it threatens you or breaches a treaty or triggers an obligation of alliance. I did not consider Iraq fitted into this philosophy, though I could see the horrible injustice done to its people by Saddam.
So Craig, for the sake of the audience, Tony Blair, the giveaway there is he goes after, he talks about the Treaty of Westphalia of 1648, that era has to be over, and the system he's espousing coming in to take its place, where countries don't have to respect other sovereignty anymore, they can intervene.
The Treaty of Westphalia, Robbie, ended the 100 Years' War. I mean, this was a bloody war amongst many countries in Europe, and the principle that was established by Cardinal Mazarin at that time was this principle of the advantage of the other, that you think about in terms of trying to establish a peace and global economic development. You think about, well, what do we have to do in order to further our neighbours?
So it's not a chauvinistic national interest where I'm all right, Jack Bugger, the rest of you. It is a national interest and strict national sovereignty, but you do have a community of neighbours.
Yeah, and it's look, you take it to the refugee problem, not problem, but the policy we have today, right? We lock them up in detention centres. What does that mean for the generations of kids that are locked up in detention centres? What does that mean for the families of people here that see their relatives and so forth locked up in detention centres? The ill will and the hate that builds up over generations, which is what ISIS is feeding off, is the problem. What if you had a policy of saying, oh look, come, we'll look after you, we want to make you implicitly part of our country, we want you to make a contribution, we'll look after your kids, we'll give them education, we'll make sure your health is good, because obviously you've come from a bad place. What does that breed? What does that develop in the people? It breeds a sense of, oh, this country's looking after me,
faith
a sense
in
of
human
goodwill.
nature,
And this is what the Treaty of Westphalia is about relationships between countries that promote the benefit of each other.
But it's also based on, you've got to respect the sovereignty though, because it's their neighbour. And Tony Blair is admitting in this speech that from 1999 onwards and even earlier, he led this globalist ideological agenda to get rid of that, and we're going to have a globalist world where we, might makes right, we with the might decide who rises and who falls.
And that's been totally rejected. You only have to look at the BRICS nations, Brazil, Russia, India, China and South Africa, the sort of collaboration that they've been doing and continuing, but it's not reported about very much in the West, and how much it's come under attack by the exact same Western forces that have promoted this war agenda.
Yeah. All right, well that's it, Craig, for this week's CEC Report. You can get our material from the Australian Alert Service if you call in for a copy. Tune in next week for more CEC Report.
You've been watching the CEC Report, the weekly TV show of the Citizens Electoral Council of Australia. What can people do to find out more, Robert?
Well, they can get on our website, www.cecaust.com.au, or they can call our toll-free number for Lisa to order a copy of this, the Australian Alert Service, which is our weekly publication where we write up all the material we use. That number is 1-800-636-432.